Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Mick Mulvaney. Welcome, Mr. Director. Let's start with the budget. A budget passed out of the Senate this week, setting the stage for tax cuts. But that budget does not achieve balance. That's something you wanted as a congressman. So why doesn't it achieve balance, and why isn't that a big problem?
I think we've made a decision now within the administration that Plan A, or part of Plan A, which was to try and cut our way to balance, just wasn't going to get very far in Washington, D.C. We had offered $54 billion worth of discretionary cuts in our budget back in March. Only about $4 or $5 billion have survived so far on the Hill. We're not going to be able to cut our way to balance. So the next part of the plan, the next part of that, sort of the calculus, right? Deficits are revenues less expenditures, is to focus on the revenues. How do we get government revenues up? The way that we balanced the budget, John, back in the 1990s was fiscal restraint, slower growth in government, plus huge economic growth that drove wealth for families, but also drove receipts to the government.
Let me go back to that spending question, though. Republicans for a long time have talked about spending restraint, and so to now say, well, we're going to do it through growth, that's no small deal. It's like Weight Watchers saying, well, we're going to give up the dieting part.
Yeah, well, you're not giving up entirely on spending. It's just you have to sit there and go, okay, there's two parts to this equation. There isn't the political will on the Hill right now.
Why not? Why you're in charge? Republicans in charge. They've run over this for so long.
Yeah,
why no will?
It's difficult, I think, to cut spending in Washington. It really, really is.
But is it lack of will of the members, lobbyists, constituents?
There's all of the above. It really is. Washington is designed to spend more money. It's probably too deep in the weeds for this show, but the 1974 Budget Act, which drives everything that we do, every dollar that we spend, is designed to spend more money one year from the next. That's the bill that says if you spent $100 last year and $104 this year, we call it a cut. I'm not making that up. So the law really is set up to spend more money. It's hard to get out of that cycle.
Well, here's why I ask. Because there's a lot of questions about outsiders and insiders. Mm-hmm. And what sometimes happens is people as an outsider say, we got to do this, that, and the other thing. Then they become an insider, and they realize either through expediency or maybe things are just more complicated than they thought, that they don't follow up with what they said when they were campaigning. That disconnect has led to serious splits in political parties, and it's happening in the Republican Party. So why would somebody looking at this from the outside say, well, now they're in power, they're just doing the easy thing?
But listen, you've got bigger issues than just spending that fall into that category. You've got Republicans who have promised to repeal and replace Obamacare. They haven't done that yet on the Hill. You've got Republicans who have promised to do tax reform. Now, we had a huge step in that direction this week, and I think we're making a lot of progress on it, but we haven't done that yet. There's a lot of things we haven't followed through on our party. You've seen the president act with a great deal of frustration in reaction to that. You've seen a lot of frustration back home with people from that. So yeah, absolutely, we have to start keeping our promises, but passing this budget this week, which is the next step and an absolutely critical step to get tax reform, was a big step forward in keeping that promise.
Let's talk about taxes. There was a framework released. It included removing the deductibility for state and local.
Right.
Now there seems to be some wobbling on that. What's the status of removing that as a deduction?
I hope they don't wobble. Keep in mind, what the president wants here, John, is something that is simpler, better, and fair. And this is one of those issues that goes right to the fairness issue. If you and I make the same amount of money, we live in a house that has the same value, our car is the same car, should we pay the exact same amount in federal taxes? We should. That's fair. But if you live in New York and I live in South Carolina, I actually pay more in federal tax than you do, and that's not fair, and we hope that does remain part of the process.
Let's tick off a couple other things that have been discussed. What's the status of the carried interest loophole? This is tax treatment that helps hedge fund managers. The president called it, they said they were getting away with murder when he was a candidate. It wasn't in the framework. Where is it now?
Keep in mind, the stuff that wasn't in the framework is stuff that we weren't able to sort of come to general agreement on with the House and the Senate leadership going into the more detailed discussions, which will start now. So that's why the framework was still very important, because we did have agreement on the basic rates, on corporate reductions, on reform, and so forth. So it's not in the framework. It means, well, we're going to put that aside to discuss later. And later is now. But I will confirm to you, the president still believes that the carried interest is probably something that needs to be looked at very, very closely.
Because you talked about fairness, and the president as a candidate went right to that fairness argument and said they're getting away with murder and the middle class is getting nothing. Why not just say this must be in tax reform?
I think it was up to the president. You probably would, but again, we have to work with the Senate.
He's not shy about saying what he wants. Why be mumbly on this one?
We have been very careful here now to make sure that we are focusing on what we agree on as we release that framework. Okay, so the things that we agreed on go in the framework. Things that aren't agreed to in advance, they go in committee, and that's the process that starts next week.
Final question: bipartisan health reform. The president seemed to be supporting the Alexander Murray. Now he says he's not. What's the status of that?
Yeah, and I saw the first statements talking to the president about it. He's where he has been from the very beginning on CSRs, which is, I want to get a deal. I don't want to give this money to insurance companies. I don't want to give money to these CEOs who make tens of billions of dollars.
But the bill's written in a way that won't give it to them.
It is, but he doesn't want to do any of that without also getting something for folks who are being hurt. And I think the criticisms you've heard this week are like, look, I'm okay with doing a deal. This is the president now, but I'm not getting enough for the folks who are getting hurt. So give me more by way of associated health plans. Give me more of the things that we know we can do for folks back home to actually help them. I think there's actually a pretty good chance to get a deal. It's just Murray, Alexander, in its current form probably isn't far enough yet.
All right, we'll have to leave it there, Mr. Director.